policy as code with some major tooling like Open Policy Agent. We have great guest here today, Ádám Sándor, who was responsible for part of this Open Policy Agent and knows the problems, knows the ideas behind it very, very well. My name is Raf Mawani, and I'm representing FikaWorks today. Together with me, I have Piotr Szwed and Wojciech Kocjan, also collaborating with FikaWorks, cloud native engineers, cloud native architects, leads, and the guys that know the stuff. Ádám, first of all, thank you for accepting the invitation.
Thanks for inviting me.
If you could tell a few words about yourself to our audience.
Yeah, so from my background, I'm a software engineer from Slovakia. I moved to the Netherlands like 8 years ago, so I'm calling from Amsterdam now. And I used to do software development for enterprise companies for a long time, and then moved to cloud infrastructure, and where we work together at Container Solutions. So I was spent a good 5 years building cloud infrastructure for different companies, being immersed in the world of Docker and Kubernetes. And from there, I moved into a solutions architect, sales engineer role at Styra, which is the company behind Open Policy Agent. So it's the company who is maybe the biggest name in pushing policy as code in the cloud native world, and they keep building the Open Policy Agent and commercial products on top of that. And and recently my most recent career move is to go from Styra to Miro, where at Miro I will be working as part of the authorization team as a user of Open Policy Agent and building a centralized authorization service on top of that. So hopefully that's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, so from consultancy, from implementing OPA to basically consuming what APA is.
Yes, to actually build something with it instead of just telling people about it.
Build something meaningful on top of that.
Yeah.
Okay, Ádám, like an open question for now. Imagine that your 20-year-old nephew just got accepted to computer science studies, and never worked with production, but he talked to you a year ago, learned about Kubernetes and all this cloud native movement, so did some homework. How would you explain what is actually the deal with all these policies, why it is important?
Right. Well, let's say I would. Yeah, it's an interesting question too. Like somebody who is new to the industry, because people who are new to Kubernetes would probably actually not use policies, because it's a problem that comes with scale. But maybe somebody who is at university studying these things, well, they could imagine a lot of people using, let's say, the university systems, where, let's say, you have a practice project and you need a place to deploy it, to show it to your professor or whatever. Now, what happens in that area where, let's say, on those servers or some cloud infrastructure, whatever, where everybody is deploying their things. Now, somebody will sooner or later break the system. They're deploying all kinds of random stuff there, and some application will do something that will break it, or there could be a security issue. Somebody might want to hack their own grades or something. And this is where policies come in. So you can do policies by writing a wiki page about all the things you're not supposed to do, right? And that's actually what happens in many organizations. Like, there is a wiki page that everybody's supposed to read, and then they get scolded if they don't follow the rules, and why didn't you read the wiki page, and all these discussions. But of course, and people don't like to read wiki pages, especially they will never notice that the wiki page has been updated, and somebody with malicious intent will not really care about the wiki page. So, and that's where automated policies that are defined as code and can be interpreted and enforced by the system itself, that's where these come in place. They will tell that you should not run processes as root on the servers or containers on Kubernetes. As the root user, you should not be able to connect to this and that URL, etc. So in a way, even network policies are they're even called their policies, their security policies. And what we do with policy as code, we really define them in a way that computers can understand it and automatically enforce it, so nobody has to rely on a wiki page.
Okay, so what are the options? One of the options is to enforce some policies on Kubernetes, right? Are there options which we could consider apart from OPA, Open Agent Policy, which we'll move in a minute?
To what end? What do you mean?
Yeah, for the application, right? So enforce the policy. So we know that the policy is important. We need to manage it somehow. How can we do that?
You mean besides writing a wiki page and besides doing policy as code?
Yes, exactly. What are the options in between? Then we'll move why the OPAs.
Right. Well, in between, I don't know, maybe you could have some kind of monitoring, alerting, and then like manually hunt people down to and fix the problems. So in a basically act in a reactive way, or just scan your system, even more reactive, basically just whenever you feel like it. You run a scan and check what's there, and then get rid of the stuff you don't want to be there. That's one idea. I'm not sure if you're aiming to for something with this question. Feels a little bit like you have something on your mind, but I'm not sure I'm guessing it right.
Open Policy Agent is basically solving the issue, right? But there were some steps in between before we realized that that we need kind of solution like OPA, right?
Right. Okay. So So the in between steps. So OPA is a general purpose policy engine. That means it can solve in one box many of the policy problems, right? The in between steps were specific solutions to specific policy problems. So let's say network policies in Kubernetes is one thing. It solves the problem of which service can talk to which other service, or policies inside Istio, for example, or firewall rules. Right, that was the ancient way of doing policies on the network. We still do it because they're very effective for certain cases. The on the application layer, policies were implemented as code. So one of the big drivers of the adoption of OPA is actually the move towards microservices. So when you had one monolithic application, actually implementing all your security policies and business policies, like what can you like authorization policies, mainly what can users do in your application, it was pretty efficient to do it in the language that the monolith was built in. It's a Java application. You just wrote all these rules mixed in with your business logic in Java. That has its downside. So even in such a context, OPA can have a positive impact. But there, the need wasn't really strong. However, once you start breaking up this monolith potentially into services that are even written in different languages, suddenly you have this problem of where does the authorization policy go. So basically, there are basically two areas where that both converge towards using OPA. Is the infrastructure side, where you needed a more generic framework than these like kind of like static configuration like network policies, and the application side where you needed to move the logic out of the application itself and make it more easily manageable and more centralized.
Can you use OPA also on the data level, basically? So enforce
On the what
policies
level?
on.
Sorry.
Can you use OPA on a data level as well? So not only applications, like if I have like access to certain feature or functionality, but also I'm allowed to see just maybe a subset of geographies in the application. So it's sometimes called role level security or content
Right.
based security, something like that.
Right. So the answer to that is a bit complicated. So data authorization is not the strongest suit of OPA. It doesn't really have like specific features to authorize on data. However, because it is a general purpose engine, so basically you can do whatever with it. Maybe something will be less easy and straightforward than other things. So if you would want to authorize on data, what we would do with OPA is OPA would give you as the policy result some kind of data object that describes your filters that then you would translate into SQL or whatever language your database uses. So your own application layer code would be there in between OPA and the database. There is no like native integration between OPA and databases. This is, by the way, up to the databases. They could totally do this and would be really cool. They just haven't yet, I think, and only because OPA is just still growing. And I would be surprised if we wouldn't see this in 1 or 2 years that databases would start natively integrating with OPA, especially now that like cloud providers are using Gatekeeper, etc. So it's
Mm-hmm.
becoming kind of mainstream.
From data governance perspective, it's not just only about the application and the functionality, but also
Yeah,
um, the data behind that.
yeah,
And when we have like data heavy applications, this becomes an issue, right?
yeah.
So coming back to the OPA and its strong sides, uh, what are the like the most valuable benefits for organization to use OPA? If you were to summarize to your C-level
Yeah,
executive.
yeah. I think the biggest impact, the most like ideal environment for OPA is a large organization that has tons of different policies spread out all over the organization, implemented in different technologies, and they are having a very hard time managing all of those. So OPA can then provide a platform basically that where you can centralize all of these policies and basically have one technology stack for your what can I deploy to Kubernetes policies as well as which users have access to which part of my application policies. Those two will be very different policies and you will still have to implement both. It's not gonna just magically like come out of the box. However, when at a certain scale, it is very beneficial to have them in the same language, deployed in the same manner, enforced using the same technology. So it provides a very strong foundation for policy standardization in a large organization. That's one. That's I think
Mm-hmm.
where it's potentially can give the biggest benefit because it solves a big problem that large companies have. And then there are the two like more specific use cases is the infrastructure use case and the application use case. Actually, both are quite different. For the infrastructure use case, it's about the what is allowed to be deployed, created, deleted, etc. in the infrastructure and answering that question basically. For example, you can hook up OPA with Terraform and then check if like I don't know this user should not be allowed to create a new cluster or delete the production cluster, these kind of things. And usually cloud providers of course have IAM for these things. However, IAM is more of a static configuration thing, so it gets huge. You cannot do abstractions over it. You can't get smart with it unless you start generating IAM. And with OPA, with the Rego language, you can So yeah, by the way, we didn't really introduce OPA. So just to give a very quick explanation here, OPA is an engine that executes Rego. Rego is a declarative policy language that's also very flexible. So it's declarative, but it's not a YAML file basically. So it's way more flexible. You can build abstractions in it and then you reuse those, etc., like in a real programming language. But it is a declarative language, so you don't write for loops and whatever. It can very efficiently work with like hierarchical data that you have about your users, about your environment, and etc. And then you put the Rego into the OPA, and then you can start asking OPA questions about, is this allowed? Is that allowed? Is that not allowed? And OPA will tell you yes, no, or some more complex answer when needed. So infrastructure use cases, what can I deploy to Kubernetes, what can I deploy to my cloud, etc. And you can do this with OPA in a much more flexible manner and also reusing data. So basically you can feed data about your users, about your opening hours, about who is on call, all these kind of extra data that then you can process and use in your policy decisions. So you can basically build smarter policies than, let's say you could rebuild Kubernetes RBAC using OPA, but you could do way more than what Kubernetes RBAC can do. Usually people don't rebuild it, but theoretically you could. Then the other use case is the application use case, which we already mentioned, is when you have services that need these decisions on, can this user do this action? And then you can either hook up OPA to an HTTP proxy like Envoy and do your authorization on the HTTP level, which is really nice because then you don't have to touch the application code at all. If you add the service mesh into that, where all your services are already fronted by a proxy, even during inter-service calls, means you can just configure all those proxies to connect to OPA and ask OPA whether a request is allowed. So you basically will be applying policy to all communication in your network. And again, that policy can be very smart, can use data, so can do way more than, let's say, Istio's native traffic policy configurations. And that's the HTTP. If you do it on the HTTP level, of course, you can get even smarter if you integrate OPA into your application, because the application can send more data to OPA, can be smarter about it. Because, of course, on the HTTP level, you can just say yes, no, request goes, request doesn't go. On the application level, you can do more clever things with the return of OPA, like filtering database data. OPA can say, yeah, the request is allowed, but this user actually shouldn't be reading that data. And then in the application logic, you can do something with that information. So yeah, these are all I think the main use cases, and it's a long-winded explanation because yes, OPA is used in very different contexts, so it takes a while to explain that.
Yeah, it has to be universal in a certain way for the
Yeah.
for the use case and for these policies.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was the biggest OPA implementation that you've seen? Like the most complex one, if you can share some numbers.
It's hard for me because I'm terrible at remembering numbers, but like thousands of OPAs deployed is easily the case. But it's like it's super different with different companies because
Uh-huh.
of the same, like imagine the question, asking the same question about Kubernetes, like what's the biggest like Kubernetes deployment, and you go to one company and they have 50,000 clusters, and you go to another company and they have four but with 50,000 nodes. So it's like it's a little bit similar with the OPA deployments also. So depending on the use case and depending on what they do and how their infrastructure looks like,
Mhm.
so I've seen companies that had thousands of Kubernetes clusters and then installed OPA on all of them. So had a, but then, for example, didn't use necessarily a super complex policy set for those. Basically, they locked down some basic things that never should happen on all those clusters, and that's what OPA was doing. For the application use case, also it really varies because OPA is also flexible in its deployment model. So You can use OPA as a centralized service, in which case you will not have that many instances, but you can also use OPA as a sidecar, basically,
Mhm.
to reduce latency, increase availability at the cost of basically loading any data and policy that OPA needs into all sidecars. So again, that goes from like large company using maybe 10 OPAs in a high available centralized service setup versus other company using hundreds of OPAs as sidecars. The best metric maybe that can be like, and I will not remember numbers for that, is the number of decisions that, let's say, all your OPAs are taking on a given
Interesting.
day in your company, because that's the main thing OPA does is make decisions, and then you would also log those decisions, so you kind of know how many you have, and let's say million decisions per hour at larger companies is easily the case.
Okay,
And actually,
so
some of the largest OPA deployments are not Styra customers. So, like Netflix uses OPA. So, it's probably beyond those numbers and in those places.
okay, I was just asking if like how complex can the how complex yeah, never mind. Okay, so let's move to you described what OPA is or what OPA is, basic components, uh, and how actually does this dynamic updates of the policies work? So because this is one of the features, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, it's so as I said, OPA uses the Rego language. Um, when it's loading Rego, it kind of works like the browser and JavaScript. So it reads the pure source file and parses it, and then builds an in-memory model of that. Um, so that code can be replaced in a running OPA. So OPA supports dynamic code loading and basically replacing the whole. The really it's not like replacing small parts. It's really about it's meant for replacing the whole policy. Although actually that's not true. So let's talk first about just the OPA has an API that you can call and can replace a policy file that's loaded in OPA. That's the least frequent. That's like not the recommended high level use case. It's more of a low level thing. If you would like be building your own authorization system around OPA and you use OPA as a low level component just for making
Mm-hmm.
decisions, maybe, and you manage your Rego and your policy in your own way, you could use the OPA API to just say, I'm replacing this policy file. It's just the REST API. You send the new policy, it gets replaced in OPA's memory. So you don't need to do any compilation, any building, anything. You just call it. And of course, in a real environment, if you do this, you're into a lot of complexity because you have lots of OPAs running everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
You have to call that those APIs, etc. Even if you would have OPA in a high available setup, you would have to make sure each instance gets the new policy. It would be all up to you. So the high level way of loading policies into OPA is the bundle API, which is pretty simple thing actually. That's a nice thing about OPA. Everything is pretty simple about OPA except like the language itself. That's like building the language, like interpreting the language, etc. The core function. Everything else is like as a user, it's very simple. The bundle API simply OPA just you give OPA an HTTP endpoint, and OPA will regularly reach out and see if there is a new policy bundle there. A policy bundle is just a zip file of the Rego files. OPA will connect there. Did anything change? Yes. Fetch the zip file, unpack it, replace the policy in memory. That's it. It's a very simple mechanism, and but very powerful. So basically, you can just use an S3 bucket, or of course use Tyra's commercial thing. It's called DAS to update the policies, and the open policy agents running everywhere in your environment will automatically fetch the policy. So it will be a quite different deployment model than what you use for your applications, because the idea is that policy needs to change faster than applications. Say you have a security problem, you want to like go and and patch that as fast as you can. And you don't want to use your like redeployment methods. It also means that all the OPAs can be running in different environments. Let's say one is running on Kubernetes, another is a process on some VM. They will all be getting their policies in the same way. So that's the way how policy can be dynamically replaced. And one more thing to add there is actually, yeah, the most popular OPA project that uses OPA is of course Gatekeeper, that integrates OPA with Kubernetes. And actually Gatekeeper is an example of using that low-level OPA API.
Mm-hmm.
Because Gatekeeper doesn't use the bundle API. Gatekeeper expects you to put your policies as custom resources into Kubernetes. They call them constraint templates. Basically, the constraint template would be a custom resource that has Rego code embedded in it, and then you make a constraint, which is just giving parameters to the constraint template, and the gatekeeper process will actually pick up the constraint and call the OPA API to put that Rego code into OPA. So yeah, Gatekeeper is a good example of using the low-level API and doing a whole very very Kubernetes native way of deploying the policies.
Okay, so we have dynamic policies. What about sharing of these policies between like different services, different infrastructures, even, right?
Yeah, so you can build up your own policy libraries. As I say, it's a programming language. The only thing that's still missing, and there is a new project that is starting to work on it, is a proper dependency package manager. So right now it's a bit of a manual process where you have to pull in any code yourself that you're also using in your policies. But besides that, it's kind of, you can imagine, is the same as, let's say, with JavaScript. You have your main JavaScript file where you have your code, and then you put other JavaScript files next to it, and then you can use those. So it would be exactly the same with OPA. So you can nicely build up your internal company library of like policy templates, maybe helper functions, everything that you need, and in all the different places, infrastructure applications, wherever it's suitable, you can reuse them.
Yeah, so, but in a complex environments, like I can imagine this is probably something that's happening all the time. What about kind of clashes, overlapping rules, conflicts, basically? Because I don't think anyone is going into centralized policy library, especially in the complex environments. So how do you deal with that? Or how OPA is dealing with that?
So, well, first of all, you need to test your policies. So in the end, a certain set of policies will go into your bundle that gets deployed. So try to not put policies in there that have conflicting results.
Yeah.
In the end, there would be one execution path, so you can't really arrive at conflicting results, but you might arrive at unexpected results with certain inputs or something. Generally, OPA policies are structured in a way where you're listing reasons to deny something. So in that sense, it's hard to be in conflict because, well, you have 20 reasons to deny a request that would fire for a certain request, right? I'm denying this because the user is root, it's asking for privileged access, and then you go through this list of like apply all these different rules to, let's say, an incoming YAML file that's like describing a deployment to Kubernetes. So it's hard to have conflicts in there
Mhm.
because in the end you either add more reasons to deny it or you don't. And you could go very fancy and like build yourself a little like thing where your certain cases you have an overriding deny, overriding allow, and whatever. But I think that's too complicated to explain just like just here. So that's I'm not really aware of a scenario where that would be a big issue. The issue is rather that your policies would produce unexpected results. And yes, you like Rego supports unit testing, and also because of the nature of OPA, that it's a request response thing always. It has no state from the end user's point of view, so it's quite easy to test in that sense. Yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. You've mentioned that it's basically about denying stuff, so denying the roles or denying the functionalities. Can you switch it to a
Yeah,
completely different approach? So
yeah.
deny everything and allow, so service by design. So if you're not allowed, then you're ultimately denied to do something.
Yes, yeah, you can absolutely do that. So there are basically this is there is a old technology back from like the XML days called XACML, XACML, that kind of does the same thing as OPA does, but in some terrible ways. But something that's interesting there, they explicitly spell out things like default allow and default deny and so on. While in OPA, basically it's more the language allows you to do both. There is no like a one single way to do it, but it's very simple. If I would be showing Rego code now, it would be very simple to explain, but I'm not, so let's just rather stay at like, yes, you can do default allow and then deny reasons versus default deny, and then list the reasons why it would be allowed.
Um, so coming back to like more business reasons why you want to use OPA. So instead of having one like authorization one place, standardized way to manage policies, what about standards and compliance basically
Yeah,
in front of the legal team,
yeah,
for
yeah, yeah.
example? How's it being
So
supported, or maybe there are some standard policy libraries that you can apply. To be SOC compliant, you have to do this.
yeah, so for certain use cases, yes. So Kubernetes, yes. Terraform, yes. There are some open source ones, and there are also some like Styra provides some proprietary ones that are then covering like certain standards like the MITRE attack and ISO something something. I don't remember now. I've been on sabbatical for a month now, and so my brain is kind of starting to
All these
drop
three
things.
letter abbreviations,
Um,
right?
Sorry.
All these three letter abbreviations that are learned
Yeah,
by
yeah.
heart by legal teams.
Yes, yes. So that's one thing. So there are, you can Google it. There are open source Rego libraries, both for like, let's say there are some for Gatekeeper specifically. There are some for like Terraform. There are some for just pure OPA. Um, so there is plenty. You can just draw one. When it's a very well defined use case like the Kubernetes or let's say Terraform for AWS,
Hmm.
right? You need to have your data model as the input, like logged down. That's where you can start building generic policies. When it comes to your application policies, there it's a different game, right? Because your data model is not locked down. It's the data model of whatever your own custom application is. So nobody can write you like a policy library that will make you ISO something something certified. So what OPA provides for the security team in these cases is that, well, at least if you write your Rego nicely, then the Rego will be more easy to audit than let's say Java code or TypeScript or whatever. Also because it's just less flexible, and so you can't do like weird things in it. And the other is that OPA will be the central place for all your authorization decisions, and it can log all those authorization decisions with the inputs and the result.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that these logs can be collected and specially stored, and they will be basically your organizational audit logs on all your authorization decisions, and that's a nice thing for security teams to have access to. So they can see, let's say you have a data breach because your policy was not denying user X access to some, I don't know, S3 bucket. And you can at least go back in history and see all the accesses of that S3 bucket um, in your OPA logs, in your OPA decision logs. So these are not just the OPA logs. This is a very specific thing, the OPA decision log, which also integrates with the bundle API. So OPA can actually, when it's fetching policies from that bundle API, it can also upload decision logs at that moment to that endpoint. So it's a special mechanism for collecting logs that helps with like basically isolating these logs as something special and not mixing them in with random application things.
Does OPA support any analytics of this decision logs or
No,
alerting on some anomalies or something like that? Or it's just the log and you have to implement something else on top of that
yep.
to okay, the anomalies. Yeah, because
So,
there's anything. Yeah, go ahead, Wojtek.
so related to that, it kind of seems natural that you would want to, let's say, replay the log against updated OPA rules. So say I noticed there's something wrong, and then as you mentioned, large organizations, the set of rules will be quite large. How difficult there is it to pull, let's say, the logs for the last n days and then apply them against the baseline OPA or OPA offline or like outside of the real infrastructure, then apply the updated one and see the differences? Are there built-in tools for that? Is it something that should be easy to like build on my own? How would I go about that if I were to
Yeah,
do it?
that's a great question. I'm guessing you know some things about OPA. It's actually because of the statelessness of OPA combined with these decision logs. Decision logs contain the inputs and the outputs that OPA basically made in the past. You can grab a chunk of your decision logs from the past, let's say, and replay them against like an OPA that you just start up. And this is great because basically it's like testing in production. So you have these real decisions from the real world, and now you're updating your policies. And of course, you'll have your unit tests and everything, but you never really know, like, did I screw something up? Well, I put these policies in production and they will have some unexpected impact. So what you can do is you replay your policies, your previous decisions against the OPA, but the OPA has the new policy loaded in it, and uh, and you will see whether now you're getting the same responses or different responses, and if are those different responses expected based on the change from your policies. So of course you're expecting different responses because you have changed the policies, but let's say did all the responses change, or is this supposed to be a minor change? But now still like 90% of the responses are different, then probably something is going wrong. So we at Styra call this impact analysis, and this is a built-in feature of basically of Styra's commercial product.
Okay, so that's right. So that's something that's easily built, that can easily be built on top of OPA.
Yep.
And I guess then the next obvious step is I would do that if I don't have enough unit tests to be like certain that my change doesn't break anything. So then obviously I can just take some of the things I pulled from the log and then also just add more unit tests so that in the future it's easier to validate, correct? Like that
Of
should just
course,
be copy pasting. Okay, awesome.
you can always add more unit tests.
Right. And do you have any strategies for like large scale unit testing of policies? I think that's always challenging when you're like when your organization, your infrastructure and everything, you're trying to apply policies to roles. It's really challenging to make sure you don't have accidental conflicts or accidental changes. So how would you go about that? Or how would you recommend people go about that?
Yeah, I'm not claiming to be an expert on that, so I have not implemented like large scale OPA policies for tons of cluster, and it also very much differs on what your why are you using OPA in the first place, right? Some organizations would just use it to lock down some like basics like no root access for or can't run processes as root in containers or whatever. Some organizations would go much more fancy. I'm guessing that the first place where you would start would be to like just test for the really important things that you put OPA in the first place, right? So you probably have some reasons, some certain maybe a security breach you had last week, and those would be the things you would start testing for first. And then I don't know, maybe like for like some fancy stuff that you can do for like really complex policies, once like things have grown a little bit out of proportions for just like simply typing in another unit test, maybe some data driven tests where you could submit different variations of, let's say, a deployment object that are auto generated or grabbed from production or something, and then maybe you have lots of them but you know what's the expected outcome for them, so now you can you can run those through as part of your unit testing, run those through OPA and check the decisions. But I'm just like coming up with ideas on the spot right now.
Okay, so a related question: have you seen, or are there any typical anti-patterns when implementing OPA, both in unit testing or in general when applying OPA to your infrastructure organization applications?
Good question, and you bit got me there. Have you?
Well, I guess either too broad or too narrow policies for some things, which are then difficult to manage over time. But no, not really. I was just curious because I suspect you have way more experience than I do in OPA. I just used it in some
Yeah,
projects in some
so
companies.
bulk of my experience also just so because I was a solutions architect, so that means I was mainly talking to new clients. So I was usually guiding people on their initial implementation of journey and architectural choices and so on with OPA. So I was rarely down. I did encounter sometimes working with like existing customers, but that was not my priority. So that's why also I don't have a ton of experience with large scale OPA deployments, or like more like these kind of anti patterns and problems that it comes down to. I think what I've seen was sometimes quite scary looking policies. Like OPA, Rego can be very nice when you, let's say, abstract away the ugly parts if you need to, if you have some parts that are becoming complicated code or whatever. But in the end, your highest level Rego file is going to be a list of simple statements that you're making about what should or should not happen, in your cluster or in your application. It should be easy to read, and it should be clean and easy to read, because that's the whole point, that it kind of even nearly should be something you can show to an auditor. And I've seen policies that were like, I have no idea what's happening here.
For
So-
me, an obvious anti-pattern would be to use OPA for very agile projects. So
For what?
very agile and dynamic projects. Like if they deploy on Monday with daemon set, on Tuesday with stateful set, if they introduce service mesh on Friday, right? So if you assume that the project is changing very fast, they change the number of microservices, they change the way of deploying stuff all the time. I think that would be a little bit too crazy to introduce OPA at its early stage. And I would consider OPA to use only for more stabilized projects that are running for for years. and are not changing too fast. So
I think you have a good point there. So definitely the point where you start using policies is when you know your policies, right? That's the like, yeah, if you're just in some experimental early stage, you don't care about policies. You need to deliver customer value. And however, even then you can have some policies like exactly like the basics, like the pod security policy stuff on Kubernetes. So depends on like how security conscious you are, and do you want to be a little bit future proof, that instead of like some basic Kubernetes primitives like PSP, I know PSP is deprecated now, can't remember what's the new thing's name exactly, but like just you want to just drop in gatekeeper there and have like with the configure it with the set of basic policies that will not hinder you during your agiling thing, because you just shouldn't, there are some things that you shouldn't do even in this stage, then that can work. But yeah, generally policies are starting to be important with more teams, etc. And you have 3 people, they'll even they can read the fucking wiki page, right? It's when you have 50, then suddenly it's like then they won't.
Yeah, especially when it's cross organizational. What are the other scenarios that OPA is not good in? So we mentioned like the very rapid development, small team. That's that's an overhead. What about other scenarios?
So we already mentioned the data.
Yes.
The data field, basically data authorization on really the database level, because you can do data authorization, but it would be in your application logic and so on. And that actually also applies to any other technology where there isn't a good enforcement point. So OPA itself cannot enforce policies. It can only make decisions, and then it needs to be integrated into something that actually can enforce those policies. And in the case of Kubernetes, the enforcer is the Kubernetes API server, which has an amazing extensibility mechanism in the form of admission webhooks. So you can configure OPA to be your admission webhook and your admission controller, and it will work beautifully with the Kubernetes API server to make decisions and enforce the policies. Now, this works the same way with Envoy for traffic on your network, because Envoy also has an external authorization provider extension. But technologies that don't, you're screwed. Like you can't really use OPA there. So now, for example, AWS is opening up more and more of their APIs to be authorized by a Lambda function. CloudFormation can now be verified by a Lambda function. So there you can they just make a Lambda function that calls into OPA, and now suddenly OPA can authorize a lot of stuff. But if that kind of mechanism is not there, if AWS doesn't provide that extension point, then you can maybe check the source files for your CloudFormation. You can do that. Like that's one of the main ways how people use OPA for Terraform. Also, because there is no point between Terraform calling the Cloud API and you to stick OPA in there, besides actually validating the TF files, which is also a very good way. No problem with that. But with, for example, the databases also, you can just do things on your application side, but you can't directly drop OPA into the database and configure some like database level rules in it until the database provider move their asses and actually provide an implementation point there.
So you mentioned integrating at the, let's say, at the TF level, and I think this brings a wider question. At which point can you integrate with OPA, right? So I think we talked about gatekeeper, and that's integrating at the level where some manifest is about to get deployed. But say as a developer, I would also want to see my PR failing or something like this. Like, what would be their ways of integrating with that, and what are the, let's say, what's the best setup for if you can set up everything up, if you have the time to do everything properly? what would be the best setup for TF, Kubernetes, or any other technology?
Yeah, so basically, OPA can very well work in a CI pipeline or on your local machine to run policies against just your pure config files. So it can absolutely do shift left and very validate things that not just in runtime. The runtime thing is generally the most powerful thing because then you know that there is no way anybody's gonna deploy something wrong. But you can feed in because OPS is basically it's a tiny little Go application. So you can just fire it up in a CI pipeline, feed it the YAML file you need to validate, and it will tell whether it's good or not. So that all works. There will be a little bit of transformation stuff needed because your pure YAML file is just a deployment, while when the Kubernetes API server calls OPA, then it's an admission review object that has the deployment inside it. So there is, you need to replicate that for OPA if you want to like test it with the exact same policies as you have in production. But that's all very doable. There is ConfTest, an open source project that does these things. It can even convert Docker files to JSON, so you can validate Docker files using OPA. Again, also Styra's commercial thing also does this. Actually, Gatekeeper was the one that was doing a pretty bad job at it, and I don't know how much it has improved, but this was one of the complaints about Gatekeeper, that they did not have a good way to run all these fancy templates, constraint templates and constraints. They couldn't really run those in a CI pipeline. So people, what they were doing was like they kept the pure Rego and then they generated the constraint template so they can run the Rego without the whole constraint template thing, which I think they still do. Yeah, so the answer is yes.
Yeah, you mentioned Rego a number of times, and which is actually one of the problems for me because it's a new language that you need to introduce to your team, SRE team, or into your infrastructure,
Yes.
right? So we need to read the wiki, quite a lot of documentation, how to use the language properly. Are there any other options that are maybe better or more efficient than Rego? Did you consider any other programming languages that could potentially replace Rego in the future? Or it's like no Rego is the best and it solves all the problems. We don't need anything else.
Yeah, well, I don't think the OPA project itself will ever replace Rego with something else. I can't remember what now, but there is some other policy language that's trying to like, hey, you can write your policies in whatever language, like Python and JavaScript and stuff. OPA's philosophy, and then there are the Kyverno people, right? Where like let's just make it YAML. Which is not really YAML, but it's a language that's built on top of YAML with weirdness. So OPA's philosophy is that you need a special programming language here because the general purpose languages are just too wide, too powerful, basically, and their syntax is not ideal for expressing policies, while the YAML style things that like IAM configuration and these things are too restrictive. So Rego is like supposed to be the ideal thing in between. I think it's a really beautiful language. You can do amazing things in it, but the pain is real. Like the learning curve is absolutely there, and what I've seen and what I would just expect is that in any organization there will be a few people who are the Rego people, very few, and the rest of the people would be basically just copy pasting the highest level rules, and then they just use libraries that other people and they wouldn't properly understand the Rego, but they would just be like users of it. Because yeah, learning Rego, I had a lot of fun doing that, but it took time.
I have to say that
Especially-
that I was also using Rego all the time as a black box, just copying, pasting stuff from Stack Overflow and Google,
Yeah,
because it was it takes time to get fluent.
yeah,
in the
absolutely,
language.
and like, and it's a great language, and but when it's not your focus really, when you just want to put some policies quickly in place, it's a big overhead to learn it. So maybe that's why also it's OPA is kind of going more towards the larger organizations where the investment is going to pay off.
Have you tested ChatGPT to write Rego policies? How was it?
Yeah, it's kind of mediocre. It's not bad, but not great because, well, basically ChatGPT's performance is directly related to how much information is on the internet about that particular language. So it can write some Rego, but it will do some weird stuff. There is just not that much Rego around for
Okay.
ChatGPT to get really good at it. It's not like writing Java or something with ChatGPT. So, but I'm sure this will. By the way, in the area of like policies, yeah, AI generated stuff is probably going to be huge in a few years because this is the area where generally the specs are relatively simple, right? I don't want this kind of user to be accessing that thing. So I would expect this to be translated to Rego should be a relatively easy job compared to like, I want a UI that's like this, but okay, which framework, which backend, which whatever, there are a ton of questions around that. But when it's just about like translating some policy requirement to Rego, that should be quite a straightforward thing for an AI.
I can imagine that having your LLM fed with a set of Rego rules, maybe just to make a bit more learning of this LLM might help to
Yep.
do something like that. So basically, you submit your infrastructure, like your design, basically, and then you ask in a plain language to get the policies.
Yep.
I have a question about the future, but one more about the production environment. So if you would about to sum up, what considerations and what things should be considered when you want to go with OPA in production?
Yeah, well,
The cookbook.
yeah, what would you, well, some surprising things that you like in a production environment need to do about OPA is protecting OPA's APIs themselves. So OPA has very extensive API, can replace code inside OPA with the API. So you definitely don't want anybody to just be accessing that API and doing whatever. So OPA has a special Rego file in it that by default is not there, and you can put one in there in a certain package, a file named a certain way, will be applied, and if you enable it with a command line parameter, then it will be Rego code that gets executed on every request going to OPA and will tell whether this particular OPA API can be accessed by this client. So that way you can either be smart or just lock it down. Alternatively, you deploy OPA as a sidecar where you don't need to do authorization. What else? That would be otherwise not really like an OPA production deployment. Like looks very similar to an OPA that you just start up on your machine. It's a simple piece of software. So just the rest of the configuration will mostly be around like data sources. So Even that is like mostly you wouldn't be accessing data sources from OPA. The data would be packaged in your policy bundle or pushed into OPA another way. So now, actually, how to get the data into OPA part is one of the trickiest architecture questions when deploying OPA. If OPA needs to use like RBAC data from your Active Directory or any data in your organization that's available and that's needed for authorization, there are few different ways to make sure that data is available during policy evaluation, or you can fetch it during policy evaluation, and all these ways have their pros and cons and different different times that they will be useful and not useful. So we could go and like spend the next half hour discussing this. So I would suggest not doing that. There is a page on the OPA, the Open Policy org docs site about different ways to get data into OPA. That just touches the surface of this this problem. But that's where you will spend. I think usually as a solutions architect, that's where I spent a lot of my time talking to clients about like how to utilize their data for authorization.
Sorry, go ahead, Rafał, go ahead.
Maybe a simple question about the performance, because you said you can fetch, there's integration, that you can fetch data from different sources. But you still have, performance constraints on the application side. So, and there's like a few moving elements within. Are there any like how OPA is dealing with this performance and how effective it is?
Yeah, so there are a few things about performance when we talk about OPA. First is the evaluation of the policy itself is super fast. So the compiled version also, because Rego is a declarative language, there's a lot of optimizations that just the compiler can make in there, can even eliminate code that it determines that this actually will never be called and so on. That's great. So usually your bottleneck is not going to be just purely policy evaluation. The next thing is, how are you calling OPA? Are you using it as a standalone process, calling it through HTTP? If yes, then that HTTP call has a cost, of course. Let's say you can run OPA as a sidecar, then you're just calling localhost, but it's still a network call, still HTTP. So there is an overhead for that. Let's say in a Kubernetes admission control scenario, this is completely negligible. In a application traffic check every single request coming into the application scenario, this can become an overhead. Actually, what I've seen from practice, I never seen anybody this becoming a real problem for anyone. But I think I was also, that's more selective for like the companies I was talking, because maybe in the first place they came to OPA, like if you're running like a super high traffic, something that's like a gazillion requests per millisecond, then you will probably not want to hook all those, send all those to OPA and have OPA make a decision. Now comes the part of the data. So if you load data into OPA's memory, which is what you want to do as much as you can, because that means the data is always available and doesn't cost extra round trip time to fetch during policy evaluation, right? So if you load data into OPA's memory, it will cost you memory. And OPA has a pretty simple way. It's not a database, so it will basically load it into Ghost structures in memory, and those can grow pretty fast. So like you can, in a realistic scenario, use like 100-200 megabytes of data, and already your OPA process will be consuming like a gigabyte or two of memory. So if you need that amount of data in OPA's memory, you will probably move towards a centralized service instead of a sidecar. There's always the option that the application just submits all the data required for a particular request on the input. So if the application knows the data, the application, well, if there is even an application, because of course, let's say a Kubernetes API server will not give you extra data, but let's say if you're calling OPA from your own application, you can like be smart about the data and just submit it on the input to OPA, and OPA doesn't need to be storing anything. But if it is, then memory becomes an issue. Actually, Styra has just a few months ago released like a new commercial thing called Styra Load, which is explicitly, and I think they renamed it to Enterprise OPA, which the main thing is less memory usage. So that's an issue with OPA, the memory usage. So I think these are, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, sir.
I just want to wrap it up with saying these are the main performance considerations.
So I was really curious about developer experience in general. We mentioned ChatGPT. We mentioned some people just copy pasting. What are your thoughts on like making it easier to learn Rego with either via some tools, language servers? So basically, just making it easier to learn and/or debug. And I think my experience was I tried writing unit tests, and we talked about that. And looking up for some past results is helpful to do that. But I always found it really difficult. Unless you know enough Rego to write those things, it's very difficult to get started. And I expect I'm not the only one, so I'm curious about it.
Yeah, so the current resources available are, one is there's the Rego Playground, where you can at least like super rapidly try things out. So there is like, it's just a web page which has your input data, your in-memory data, and then your Rego code, and you can just click evaluate, and it will evaluate it. One cool thing is just use the community. So the Open Policy Agent Slack is pretty active. There are Styra people there, so you can just anytime put your code, your inputs, and everything into this Rego Playground, and you can get a permanent link from there that you can just drop into the OPA Slack and ask people for help. And once they click that link, they have access to your full problem, basically. So you don't have to like, oh, this is my code snippet, and then people start asking you, okay, but what is your rest of what are you trying to do here? No, you get like full view of what you're doing. So that I found that the most useful usually, to ask for help from people who know Rego better than me. There's also the Styra is running not running, it's a website with a self-paced course called Styra Academy, which is really cool because basically the makers of the language are explaining how it's supposed to work, and actually that helps a lot with Rego. That's usually the biggest, I think, why, and this is, I'm just realizing this now, that why people usually run into a brick wall with Rego when they do, is because they expect it to work like a normal programming language, but it's a declarative programming language, and these days we don't use declarative programming languages. So the last time I used was Prolog in university 15 years ago. So but actually it's not that hard. However, you have to do a mind switch, and you have to really just grasp the basics of how it's supposed to work. And once you have that, everything becomes much easier. But of course, busy times, and we're so used to just copy pasting something from Stack Overflow and whatever, that yeah, we as far as we can, we try to skip that basic step of just understanding what this language is about. But yeah, that's the best I can tell you in like how to make things easier. In the future, maybe there will be better tools or something. We're also working on a graphical interface to like put together policies, which was not really a Rego editor. Styra DAS had also a Rego editor. It was not very popular because still you had to understand the Rego. But more from a high level. So like, let's say in your organization, you would write some like policy building blocks, some really high level things, and then just combine those. This has to be for that kind of user, and then some like more like analyst people can work with it.
all these interfaces to work with the low-level technologies, I would say, for the high-level business people is always a challenge.
Yeah.
Just to make it a block language or something like that. You mentioned the future. We have a chat. We have a question from the chat regarding what you're expecting will be the biggest change between now, the current version. I think it's 0.55, and 1.0. So many versions ahead, but what would be the biggest switch, the biggest change?
I don't know. There is not like there is no 100 target for OPA actually. The current version, it's not like, oh, we're at 0.55, but this is where we want to get to. I'm not the curate, and I'm not directly involved in the OPA project, so also take it with a grain of salt what I'm saying. I have some insight on it, but I never heard about a like 100 version that will have integrated ChatGPT or something, some big feature that's still on the horizon. So I actually don't think OPA is going to be building any huge big things. It does what it needs to do currently really well. It's more up to like maybe new projects that would be wrapping it and using it in new ways, like the like gatekeeper does. That's it doesn't. The gatekeeper people are not contributing to OPA, for example. They don't need to. It works. It does its job. You can build things around it. Styra has built this enterprise OPA, which it's a commercial thing because they have to make money. So that focuses on the data size for large enterprises, right? So these are the large enterprise features. So that's also not, at least right now, definitely not going into the open source OPA, and most people would not need them. So yeah, I don't think any there is any big roadmap. I'm sure there are things that there would be cool things that if I would have prepared and checked like some roadmap and checked in with the people there, I'm sure there are things on the roadmap for like the next year or something. I'm right now not aware of those, but yeah, there is not a 1.00 version that the OPA project is moving towards.
Okay. Just a closing question. What you're personally missing in current OPA?
Say again,
what you're personally missing? What functionality features you're missing in OPA, the current version? What would make your life easier? Maybe like considering your future challenge as well.
Yeah, the package management. That's definitely something that's needed there. So like, yeah, I mean that's for every language. It's a bit of a surprise that OPA still doesn't have it. One of the OPA developers has started the project now and working on it. So package management is definitely. I'm pretty sure if that project works out, it will become core OPA. So maybe that's something that will be is also can mentioned as a big feature coming for OPA. But everything else, actually, my view is more like I was basically selling the Styra product that's built for managing OPA and building policies in large organizations. So my thoughts are more around that, like how to build a graphical interface that analysts can use to configure policies without having to learn Rego programming and these kind of things. And these have nothing to do with the core OPA project, really, because this is not something that should go in there. It is more something that and actually OPA has made things to support this. Like OPA now has this kind of meta code description abilities where you can put metadata about your code in the form of annotations, and that's really useful when you're building some kind of high level development environment, right? Because you can read that information present, some like what does this rule do in a high level to a user who cannot read the Rego code itself, and so on. So yeah, unfortunately that's locked away like commercial feature, so you can't just go and try that out. But I would love to see something like this being more mainstream, because that's I think the biggest thing that the OPA project right now needs to break through, this wall of making it easy to use for non-programmers, because for OPA actually even many of the users who are programmers are non-programmers, because they maybe can program something but they can't program Rego. Then there are all the DevOps people, right, who are more like infrastructure focused, so they maybe are not even really skilled programmers in the first place for any language, and then definitely are like, what the fuck is like a decorative language now, which I can totally understand. So actually, these areas, just making it easier to use. It's not really the OPA project's concern itself, but yeah, would be very cool. And then last thing is the integrations. I would love those database providers to provide like an extension point for their databases for external authorization, because that would be awesome. If you could use Rego code to tell like in these columns in this table, no, not for that user, and so on.
That would be something. That would probably definitely expand the number of use cases.
Yeah.
Okay, Adam, thank you so much for the discussion, for bringing us closer to OPA and sharing all your thoughts and good practices on using and implementing OPA. Definitely, it's very interesting solving the issues in environments, in the IT environments, but not as easy to use as like other technologies right now. But definitely there's a future in front of OPA, and as you mentioned, with all these additional features, tools, this can be much wider adopted by organizations, and make our environments more secure. That's the goal, right?
Yeah, exactly. in the end, yes, we definitely need better ways to secure environments. Yeah.
Exactly, and less frustration from the end user perspective that you don't have access to something. Yeah. Okay, Adam. Thanks a lot. Good luck for in your next challenge.
Sorry, guys.
They're closing
Okay.
anyway. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, and talk to you next time in the future.
A lot of useful,
thank you very much
knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, guys. It was really nice. And yeah, hope to see you guys soon.